Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition as part of the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. And I'm up to Chapter 17 of 18, and this chapter, as you can see, is on how to create and use your own objects. We have 4 applied objectives and 10 knowledge objectives. Our applied objectives: create your own objects with properties and methods by using object literals, construction functions, or the create method of the object. Use the properties and methods of the new objects that you create. Create factory functions that return new objects. Use JavaScript libraries in your own applications. Those are the applied objectives. For the knowledge objectives, describe the inheritance hierarchy for the following JavaScript object types: object, string, number, Boolean, date, array, and function. Describe the differences between creating objects with object literals, with constructors, and with the object.create method. Explain how 2 variables can refer to the same object. Describe the creation, use, and benefits of JavaScript libraries. Describe the creation and use of factory functions. Describe the use of the arguments property of a function object when creating a method for an object. Describe the creation and use of cascading methods. Describe the use of prototype objects in terms of inheriting and overriding the objects. Try that one again. Describe the use of prototype objects in terms of inheriting and overriding the properties and methods of an object. Describe the use of the keyword this when creating and using objects. And finally, describe the use of the call, apply, and bind methods when setting the value of the this keyword. So this chapter, no pun intended, is on objects, especially on creating your own objects. This is one of the last 2 chapters of the book, and as I believe I mentioned earlier, these 2 chapters, those being chapters 17 and 18, along with probably chapter 15, are chapters I'm going to cover here in the slides, and that's about it. So what we see on the screen here, as it says, is the JavaScript hierarchy of some of the native objects. Now, JavaScript is different than other programming languages because it has what's referred to as a flat hierarchy of native object types. At the top is the object type, and at the next level are the 6 that you see here: string, number, Boolean, date, array, and function. All right. This hierarchy means that all of the object types are at the 2nd level. They inherit everything that is native to the object type, such as the toString method. All right. Here's a couple different ways that you can create a new instance of an object type with a new keyword. You can also create a new instance of an object type by simply declaring a variable with a literal type. And when you do that, what JavaScript does is it automatically converts the value to the corresponding native type. We'll see some examples of that later. It's considered best practice to use literal values like this to create native objects rather than using the new keyword. But sometimes you have to. For example, when you use dates, because date objects don't have a literal date value. Okay? Now, when you look in here, what you're seeing is how to access the properties and methods of an object. The common way of doing this, as you can see, is to either say the name of the object dot the name of the method, and that's probably the more common one. All right, that's object dot notation, and this is more object array notation. Either way will work though. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but sooner or later, the chances are pretty doggone good that you're going to want to come in and create your own object types. And the easiest way to do this is by storing an object literal in a variable. And this shows an example. In this first example, an object named Invoice is initialized to a property named tax rate that has a value of 8.75%. The property name and the value must be separated by a colon. And I think you can even run it together. I don't think it needs a space, but typically you see that because it looks better. In this second example here, the Invoice object is initialized with one method. All right. The method is named getTotal. The method name is followed by a colon and a function expression that does the method's task. What happens here is that the function is stored as a property of the object. A property that stores a function like this is referred to as an object method. All right, in this example right here, the third example, the Invoice object is initialized with a property and with two methods. Here the property and the methods must be separated by commas. The two methods of the object use the this keyword that you can see in yellow to get the value of the tax rate property or to call another method. This keyword in the method of an object typically refers to the object itself. Kind of look at it as being a shortcut as opposed to having to say the object name. After you create the properties and methods for an object, you can use them just like any native object. So just like anything that we looked at in here. The last set of examples that you see here shows how you can also nest one object within another. All right, so an object can contain an object. Once you create an object, the object basically isn't, for lack of better words, dead in the water. Okay? You can extend the object by adding new properties to it, by adding new methods to it. So here we've created an empty object, and then later on we just come in and we add a property, and we add a method. So to add the property, you assign a new property to the object and give it a value. To add a method, you assign a new property and code a function expression as the value. After you create a property, you can modify it by assigning a new value to it. Okay? When you create an object and store it in a variable, what you have to realize is what JavaScript actually stores in here is a reference. And what the reference is, they show the picture, there it is. What they're saying is both of these things that are in here now point. All right? These point to the same date object. What is actually stored typically in here is an address in memory of where the object actually lives. If you want to remove a property from an object, you can use the delete operator. They show that in here. There it is. So remember that a variable or a property holds a reference to the object, not the object itself. When you pass an object to a function as an argument, you're passing the reference. So any changes you make, since you're passing the address and memory of where it lives, are permanent changes. All right, let's sort of change gears here and talk a little bit about JavaScript libraries. JavaScript libraries have three major benefits. The first one, basically, by letting you group similar functionality in a single file, all right, what you're doing is you're having more of a separation of concerns. kind of the way that I think I talked about this earlier on in this course in the HTML portion, where your HTML should be in a .html file, your CSS should be in a .css file, your JavaScript should be in a .js file. Well, you can take functions that are similar to one another that you use often and put them into one or more libraries and then reuse them as what you need to. This keeps your JavaScript files smaller, and it makes them easier to understand, especially when you are reusing them. So this separation of concerns, the last one is what I already mentioned. So they've got an example in here. Whoops. There we go. This is an example that shows a simple library file named library_mpg.js. It contains an object named mpg, it's a miles per gallon object, along with the associated properties and methods. Next is an example of how you can add that file. You can add that file right to your program. Now notice the order here, because the order is important. jQuery comes first, then your library file or files, then your file that you're using for this particular application. Typically, or at least there's a chance that library MPG could modify something in jQuery or use something in jQuery, and main.js could use something in library MPG. So, a JavaScript library is it's just normal JavaScript. You create a library by grouping related functions and objects in a single file. You should name your JavaScript libraries something that's pertinent to what it is you're trying to do with them. You include JavaScript libraries in your application simply by using script elements. And we just talked about the importance of the order in which you put these in. So on 506, 507, 508, and 509, they show another iteration of the miles per gallon program. And this iteration is going to use an object and a library file to organize the code. Okay? This should make it easier for somebody to work with the miles per gallon program and make it easier to reuse it if you have to on other pages or other applications or whatever. So the first two script elements in the head section identify the two JavaScript libraries that you're going to be using, the jQuery and your own MPG library. The last one is the main JavaScript file that's going to use both of these. The HTML in here, the big thing is you'll notice the use of the ID attributes. And those ID attributes will make it easier to work with when we add the code. So again, the application is an updated version of the MPG application we first created in Chapter 4. As before, it accepts a number of miles driven and a number of gallons used, and it calculates the miles per gallon. Okay. As far as the JavaScript, it contains an object literal named MPG with two properties, miles and gallons, which makes sense. All right. And two methods. First, we've got a method called isValid, which is going to check to make sure that, or it's going to say that basically if either one of the fields either is non-numeric or if one of the fields is less than or equal to 0, we return false, which means we don't need to go on. There's no sense in calculating the miles per gallon because we don't have valid values. Otherwise, we return true, in which case we're going to do the calculation. Then we have our main.js file. So this is the one we're going to use along with the other one. This main JavaScript file is going to use the properties and the methods of the MPG object to calculate and display the MPG based on what the user entered for miles and for gallons. Now, when you create an object in virtually every programming language that I know of, so like I said, every one that I know of, what happens is a special method is created and called. That special method is called a constructor. You create a constructor typically to do a lot of your initialization, and you can call the constructor to create multiple instances of the object. So what you do basically in object-oriented programming, in a nutshell, okay, in other languages, not in JavaScript, but in other languages, you create what's called a class, and then you create objects based on that class, and that's called instantiating or instancing an object. Well, the true idea of a class does not exist in JavaScript. So instead, what we are doing in here is we are coming in and just creating the objects right away, typically again through object literals. So what the examples here are showing is how to code constructors. Okay. This is a constructor with no parameters. This is a constructor with 2 parameters. And if you say it looks a lot like what we did before, it is. This first constructor is named Invoice. It has no parameters. It creates 2 properties called subtotal and tax rate. Both of these are undefined because we didn't initialize them. Oftentimes, though, you'll want to set initial values for an object's properties. So this one was the same thing, but it was supposing we'd have a subtotal coming in and a tax rate coming in. We need the this dot here, so the system knows that this local variable coming in here is not the same as our actual object variable right here. After you code a constructor, you can add methods to it. You do that by adding each method to the constructor's what's called its prototype object. And that's what you can see in these examples. For each method, you code the name of the constructor function, a dot, the word prototype, another dot, and the name of the new method that you want to add. Then you set that equal to the function that will become the method. All right, there are some examples here on how you use these instance objects. So to create an instance, you call the constructor with a new keyword, as you can see in yellow here. After the objects have been created, you can refer to the properties and methods just like you can refer to the properties and methods of any object, including the built-in objects. A couple additional things to know about prototypes. As I mentioned to you previously, many programming languages use classes to create objects, but JavaScript does not do that. It uses what are called prototype objects that are cloned to create new objects. This makes JavaScript a classless or prototypal language. When you create a new object, it's cloned from the prototype object of its object type, so it automatically inherits all of the methods of that prototype. They give an example here on 513 to say an object literal is cloned from the prototype of the object type, a string literal from the string object type, etc. When you add a method to the prototype object of an object type, it's available to all instances of that object type. When you add a property or a method, it's created directly on the instance, not on the prototype. Okay? For that reason, it's available only in that kind of instance. That's what's referred to as a direct or own property. You can also use your own properties to override the methods of the prototype object, but it'll only be overridden for that instance. Now, that probably doesn't make a boatload of sense. And as I always tell my students, it's of the utmost importance that you go in and you read the chapter, because it'll only make sense after you read it and spend some time absorbing it, for lack of better words. So on pages 514, 515, 516, and 517, they have this trips application. What this application does is it logs the destination, as you can see, the miles driven, and the miles per gallon for several trips, rather than calculating a single MPG. Okay, so again, if I was taking a trip from St. Louis to Atlanta, okay, I could keep like a running running track of what I was doing. Now, like the miles per gallon application, the script elements in the head section use the jQuery library, followed by our custom library, followed by our main JavaScript file. Again, the order must be done in that way. Also, as before, in the main element, we're setting it up with text boxes, just like you saw before. These two things that are right here are the same as what we had before. Our old one said like calculate, now it's add trip, so you can see this. Okay? There's very little CSS in here. And here is our JavaScript. So the application, again, calculates and stores the miles per gallon for one or more trips. It uses a constructor function that you see right here to create a trip object type. This object type contains the methods needed to validate the trip, calculates the miles per gallon, and displays the information about the trip. And the code for the trip constructor is in a separate library file. And we are also storing instances of trip objects in an array. So again, that is the library file, and here's the main JavaScript. So the library trip file is for working with the data a user enters for a trip. It has a constructor function that creates the trip object type. This constructor, as you can see, accepts 3 parameters: the destination, the miles driven, and the gallons used. Within the property of the constructor, the this keyword refers to the new object the function will create. The code adds 3 methods to the prototype of the trip object type. The first 2 of these methods are like the ones in the miles per gallon application. In other words, the isValid that we'd already looked at, written a little bit differently, but pretty much is the same thing. All right. And the calculate MPG function. Then we've also got a toString function, so we're able to print everything out. So it looks basically like this format here. And it's going to keep printing out everything as we go on in our trip. The second file is our own main.js. It contains the jQuery ready function that you see up here. All right. And that drives the application. The function starts by creating an empty array to hold trip objects. Then it creates a function named displayTrips that displays all the trips in that array. Next, you've got an event handler for the click event of the add trip button. This creates a new instance of a trip object, passing to it the values entered in by the user. Then it calls the isValid to validate and make sure that the user entered valid data. If they did not, it'll alert the user, so it'll give them an alert telling them they did something wrong. Otherwise, it'll add the trip object to the trips array. The ready function ends by putting the focus on the text box for the destination. All right, I'm not sure where I am for time, but I think I'm going to stop right now and make this a 2-part presentation. Yeah, this is the time. So I'm around halfway through. All right, I'll be back in just a couple.